There's something significant to be said about holding an old photo, sharing stories past, and learning about our history. It wasn't really all that long ago pioneers exploring the Stillaguamish Valley met the indigenous people, known today as the Stillaguamish tribe of Indians. They had been living along the main channel of the Stillaguamish River in the North and South Forks for centuries. The word Stillaguamish means people of the river, and the significance of the Stillaguamish River was ever present in the early logging industry. While many stories faded with the passing years, many remain to be rediscovered within the Stillaguamish Valley Museum. Located in downtown Arlington, Washington, in Snohomish County, the Stillaguamish Valley Museum's Pioneer Hall was built in 1923, a century ago, and remains standing strong today as a community gathering place, rented locally for a variety of memorable events. After 15 years of fundraising and 5 years of construction, the adjoining museum was dedicated in 1997. The research library on the museum's main floor houses over 800 books, including high school yearbooks, locally published Ellis McAlpin historical postcards, scrapbooks put together by the daughters of pioneer families, vintage cookbooks, town histories and maps, original documents, and over 4,000 historical photographs. A visit to the museum's library offers the prospect of fond conversations, shared memories, and a truly unique educational experience. It is up to us to preserve the history of our valley, the facts, the stories, and challenges faced by everyday people more than a century ago, to understand who they were, the legacies they left, and where we are going in their place. On March 2, 1853, Congress created Washington Territory. Shortly before that act of Congress, exploration in the area known today as Arlington began when a prospector, with the help of Native American guides, traveled up the river in a canoe. Since there were no roads between the areas known today as Arlington and Stanwood, Native Americans were hired to canoe people and goods on the Stillaguamish River, the transportation highway in a vast wilderness. Early explorers, trappers, and adventurers with a remarkable zest for life sought riches, discoveries, and land, and the Pacific Northwest heavily forested areas brought a sense of awe and opportunity. As loggers migrated to this area, with its beautiful river valley and mesmerizing mountain peaks, the expansive, old-growth forest amazed them, both in their magnificence and with the possibility of commerce. So it was no surprise that the logging brought the main source of wealth for the people in the Stillaguamish Valley in the early logging days. At first, the only sawmill in the area was at the north end of Camano Island at the sawmill at Utsalati, which opened in 1858. Logs were floated down the Stillaguamish River to Stanwood and then barged to Utsalati. The town of Utsalati had a deep water port with a steamship service. Milled lumber was transported to Seattle and other locations until the sawmill closed in 1893. While logging provided an income for many pioneer families, other families purchased land, and out of that wilderness came farms that provided produce, meat, and milk for all the settlers, loggers included. Here's a photo of Ollie K. Husby, his wife Nettie, and their children around 1895. Their log cabin was located at Island Crossing, surrounded by miles of dense forest. In the days of hand logging, imagine the conditions under which these loggers felled these trees. Before the days of cross-cut saws or chainsaws, felling a single tree took men with brute strength wielding heavy axes. Then the felled trees were limbed, cut into manageable length, and dragged or rolled by hand to a nearby mill. Otherwise, the men carried or rolled the logs to the river or lake, and then dumped down a chute or rolled over a bank and floated to the nearest mill. This included cedar logs cut into bolts to be sawed into shingles. Our historian, Lauren Kratz, knows much about the Stillaguamish Valley's logging history.
The first essential tools that the loggers would be using would be two different types of cross-cut saws, one for cutting the trees down and one for cutting them up in sections. Usually had a man on each end in both cases, and it was a pull-push situation. They needed axes to chop the notches in the tree to put the springboard on. The springboard was made out of a piece of, like a 2x8 piece of lumber, probably 6-7 feet long, and it had a piece of metal hooked on one end of it, bolted on, that they could use it, had a clip. They could stick it in a notch in the tree, and then they could climb up and stand on that springboard in order to saw the tree off several feet up from the ground, sometimes as much as 12 feet high, depending on the species. They also used wedges to drive in after the saw got in a foot or two so that it wouldn't pinch the saw to make it easier. Sometimes they actually had a quart bottle of kerosene, kind of made it a lubricant so that the saw would move back and forth easier.
In the 1880s, oxen and occasionally mules were used as a power source to move logs across the primitive skid roads. A skid road was built to drag the logs from the woods to a nearby mill, or to a nearby waterway and then to a mill. The road was built with heavy timbers about 8 feet apart at right angles to the direction of the haul. Greasing the skids with whale oil or dogfish oil was considered a lowly job, one that Carl Thorson, the son of pioneer family Halvor and Johanna Thorson, was hired to do in 1906 after he quit school at the age of 15. Carl later became a high-line rigger climbing spar trees hundreds of feet above the ground because he considered it safer than other logging jobs. Innovation continued. Horses, while not as strong as oxen, were used to pull logs to the flat cars for loading. 2 groups of men used horses to haul cedar blocks from the woods at Bryant to make shingles. Then came the steam donkey, a steam engine advertised to do the work of 80 oxen. In 1887, one of the first steam donkeys was installed and used in the Blanchard Company camp on Bellingham Bay. It wasn't long before the steam donkeys appeared in the Stillaguamish Valley. Fueled by a boiler, the steam engine controlled a wench that pulled up logs up to a half-mile away. The introduction of high-line steel cables also marked a crucial time in logging by making hard-to-reach timber areas accessible on the mountain sides. However, crew members had to be on guard watching for a broken cable wildly flying through the air, endangering life and limb. In 1886, lumber milled at Camano Island's sawmill at Utsalati was used as flooring on Arlington's first schoolhouse at Kent Prairie. After being milled, the lumber was pulled up the river in canoes by natives of the Stillaguamish tribe. It was unloaded at Gifford's log landing on the south bank near today's Lincoln Bridge, and then dragged by a mule team near today's Free Methodist Church, where a 16 by 20 foot schoolhouse was built on 1 acre of land leased from J. L. Frank Kent. May Morris Murphy, once a pupil at the school, drew this sketch of the schoolhouse. About 1888, Nels K. Tweet and Nils C. Johnson built Arlington's first store on top of the riverbank at the east end of Gilman Avenue, near what used to be Country Charm Dairy's popular milk and ice cream store, at what once was called Jewel City. Loggers and others grew tired of what they considered exorbitant charges by the Indians for canoe freighting and travel. In the summer of 1889, at the urging of A.L. Blair of Stanwood, a road was constructed connecting Sylvana to where Haller Park sits today. Expansion of this road soon replaced canoe travel on the Stillaguamish River and connected to the road between Sylvana and Stanwood. While the roads were crude and full of potholes, oxen and horses pulled freight loaded onto wagons almost daily. Bert Herb Crawford did some freighting with horses and began operating stage wagon between Stanwood, Arlington, and Darrington 3 times a week, ending the isolation of so many families. Also in 1889, the area's first hotel, the White House Hotel, was built by Lee Rogers and Al Dinsmore at the forks where the North and South Forks of the Stillaguamish River merge. That same year, Washington Territory became Washington State on November 11, 1889. In the infancy of statehood, the twin cities of Haller City and Arlington were born about half-mile apart. Arlington's history and prosperity would dramatically change with the arrival of the train in 1890. Pulled by a steam locomotive, Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern Railroad's freight train reached Arlington on July 23, 1890. The train depot was built in Arlington rather than Haller City, where today's Stille Valley Chamber of Commerce stands in Legion Park. Haller's first railroad bridge was built around 1890 over the Stillaguamish River at the Forks. While it was designed to swing open for steamboats, steamboats no longer ventured up the river, so it was never opened. Rail cars were soon bringing heavy equipment for logging operations and lumber and shingle mills. As a result, logging increased and more mills were built. Into the turn of the century, prominent logging companies would follow, building private railroads to lay tracks to haul heavy equipment into the woods and transport their timber out. The area's first mill, the Dorgan Mill, was built in Howler, just west of today's Howler Bridge. This area is now known as Eagle Trail, a walking trail that meanders from Howler Park to Dyke Road. Here's Mike Dorgan standing on a log circa 1890. During the 1890s, loggers had two main vacation days, Christmas and Independence Day. Both were unpaid holidays. Many loggers and their families would have been at this 4th of July parade. Most walked to the parade, but if they could afford a bike, they would have enjoyed a warm, sunny day while riding into town. Olympic Avenue was once called Railroad Avenue. Look northeast at downtown Arlington, at Railroad Avenue in 1893, with the train tracks in the foreground. Corner of the train depot is on the far left. The two-story building in the center left is Thomas Moran's hardware store. The wooden three-story building is the Arlington Hotel at the northeast corner of 2nd Street and Railroad Avenue. The wooden two-story building to its right is Earl McLeod's General Merchandise Store on the southeast corner of 2nd Street and Railroad Avenue. Most of the trees had been logged off the hillside above downtown Arlington by 1893. The logs were milled at Arlington Lumber Company, which milled lumber and manufactured cedar shakes. It was located at Calvary Arlington Church on 3rd Street and portions of today's Merchants parking lot between 3rd and 4th Streets. In 1899, a tragedy struck in downtown Arlington at the Arlington Lumber Company. On July 29th, the shingle department, mill office, Gifford's residence, boarding house, and Cranshaws and Kennedy's blacksmith shops were destroyed in a fire.
There was an attempt to try and put it out. There was a well not too far away, and there was, I think, at least 13 men that formed a kind of a bucket brigade to try and save some things. That was a real setback to Arlington.
By the turn of the century, steam donkeys replaced oxen, mules, and horses. Oxen, burdened with dragging enormous logs, were often cruelly treated by the teamster loggers, who prodded the beast with sharp-pointed sticks. Once retired from logging, the oxen became stew meat for hungry loggers.
There were an abundance of beaver in the valley, and even the farmers afterwards did trap in their spare time, and that was a source of income too, to sell some of the furs, and often sold the carcass to a cook in a logging camp or even hotels in Arlington. And beaver stew became quite a staple. It would be perfectly edible, I guess. I have not personally had any, but it was quite an item. The loggers mostly were single men. They were 10-hour days, 6 days a week. They worked in the woods, they were pretty exhausted. They didn't have very much entertainment there. There would be a stove in their bunkhouse. Somebody might play a harmonica. They did play cards, but it was kind of a hard life. But one thing that came alive was Saturday night in Arlington. By 1900 or 1910, Arlington had 11 saloons. And there was a barber shop in the middle of town. They could get their hair cut, get shaved, and then they could celebrate in town as long as they wanted. There were a number of hotels in Arlington where they could stay and probably spend a day's wages to, I think you could get a hotel room with breakfast for about $1.25. And so some of them did stay all night. Sometimes the jail was full too, because people had a tendency to drink more than what they should have.
The lumber town of Arlington had much to be proud of. By the early 1900s, 4 shingle mills, 3 sawmills, and 15 logging camps employed nearly 500 men. The Native Americans drove cedar bolts down the river to shake mills. Due to the vast amount of shingle bolts carried down the Stillaguamish River in the early 1900s, Arlington was known as the shingle capital of the world. Here's a tree thousands of years old that grew in the Stillaguamish Valley's ancient forest with men who gathered around it in 1903. Before the cedar stump was moved to its permanent location at the rest stop, it was located along northbound Highway 99, half a mile south of exit 208, pictured here with a 1958 Chevy four-door Bel Air. Taking a photo at the cedar stump along the old highway was a popular first stop after buying a new car. And here's a cedar stump you can visit outside the museum. Arlington, our logging town, our trees, our history. The logging men, tough and dirty, braved forest dangers but endured without realizing that they were preparing a future for us. 24 men sleeping in a room, with wet clothes and stinky socks hanging by a wood stove, awoke the next day to do it again. From skid roads to today's conveniences, they paved our way. They are not forgotten. Visit the museum's research library, relive their stories at the Stillaguamish Valley Museum.